Hello, it's Christopher Roach, back again with another episode of Node Step by Step. And in this episode, we'll actually be getting back into a bit of development with Node. In the last two episodes, we took a little bit of a break and we took a look at a couple of tools that make developing in Node much easier. The first episode covered the Node Version Manager, which is a little script that allows you to manage multiple versions of Node on a single system. And in the episode prior to this one, we covered another tool called NPM, which is the package manager for the Node community. And towards the very end of that episode, we installed a package called Supervisor, which is a handy little tool that allows us to run our applications. And what it does is monitor our file system. And every time we make a change to one of the files, it'll basically reboot our application, incorporating all of our latest changes. So it allows us to basically develop our apps without constantly restarting the actual application ourselves. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our development environment, back into our code directory, and we're going to fire up our application using that supervisor tool that we just installed in our last episode. And now that we've got our application up and running, let's just go ahead and jump into our browser and take a quick look at our application to see where we left off last time and what we'll be doing in this episode. So go ahead and load up the application. We'll go to /posts/new, since that's the only view that we have up and running right now. And here we have our new post form. And now if we go ahead and fill this out, we'll go ahead and give a title and just some lorem ipsum text for the content. And then we'll hit create post and just see what happens. And it looks like we're taken to just the posts view, which is exactly what you'd expect. The problem though is that we get a 404 file not found here. And then when we take a look at our console, it doesn't look like there's a lot going on there. And there's good reason for that. Basically, we haven't set anything up on the back end to deal with processing the new post form submission. And that'll basically be our topic for today's episode. We'll be adding in the bit of code that we need to actually take the new post form submission and turn it into a bit of data that we can actually use on the back end. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our code and go ahead and get started with that right now. Okay, so now the pattern that we're using here is that we have a regular expression, which represents the URL for our new post form. And then we have an if statement that tests that regular expression against the path name for the current request. And if it matches, it'll basically render the new post form. It'll call that function for rendering that form. Otherwise, it's going to return a 404 error. So we're going to go ahead and stick with that pattern here as well. So we'll go ahead and create a new regular expression for our new URL. And this will basically be the /posts URL where our form is being submitted to. So before we do that, let's just clean this up a tiny bit. We're going to go ahead and take all of our regular expressions outside of our create server callback, and we're just going to put it here at the global level. And that should just clean up our create server function a little bit. So let me just add a little bit of commenting here, letting us know what each part of this code is doing, since our code base is going to grow slightly larger today. So we'll just go ahead and call this the routes section. And then we'll go ahead and paste our new post form regular expression. And then we'll go ahead and create our new one. And we'll just call this new post regex, since this actually processes the new post form. And it'll just be a new regular expression. And I'll just go ahead and walk you through this regular expression again, just in case you forgot what all the elements were from our last one. So the caret basically just represents the beginning of the string. So we'll do the caret character here, so /posts. And then we'll add in the trailing slash, and we'll put a question mark after that, which represents the trailing slash is either there or not there. And then finally the $sign representing the end of the string. So that should pretty much take care of our new post regular expression. So now the next thing we want to do is update our if statement inside of our create server callback to test this new regular expression against the path name for the current request. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll jump into our create server callback. But before we do that, let's just go ahead and add another little bit of comments here. So like I said just a little bit ago, I'm going to try and break up each section of our code with comments, just kind of describing what each section does. So we'll put another comment here for the server portion of our code. And then inside here, we'll just go ahead and drop our else statement down one line. And let me just tidy this up a little bit. And then we'll go ahead and add another else statement, which will be another if statement testing our new regular expression against the path name for the current request. And if it matches, we're going to want to do the same thing as we did before, which is basically to call a function that will process this specific request and construct the proper response for it. So let's just go ahead and create a new function here, and we'll call this one just add new post. And remember, we always have to pass in the request and response objects here. And now that pretty much takes care of all of the infrastructure for how we're going to deal with our new post submissions. But now we need to go ahead and create this function add new post. So let's go ahead and jump back up here to the very top where we have our last function render new post form, and we'll go ahead and add that right below it. So we'll go ahead and create the function add new post, and then remember it takes a request and a response. And for the time being, we're just going to go ahead and add a log statement here just to make sure that we've got everything hooked up properly. So we'll go ahead and say received a new post here. And let's go ahead and save this and test it out real quick. So we'll go ahead and jump back over to our browser and load up our new post form again. And then we'll go ahead and create another new post. And then notice that we're not actually going anywhere. We can see the progress meter at the very top constantly spinning, but our page isn't actually going to the /posts URL. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our terminal and see if we can't figure out what's going on there. And we can see here that we did get the output, received a new post. So it looks like our backend actually matched the /posts URL and called the add new post function. But unfortunately, we still have a bit of a problem. And looking at the add new post function, I can see it immediately. The problem here is that we never actually returned a response. So the browser is just basically hanging, waiting for a response to come back. So we need to do something about that. And the only thing that we actually really need to do here, since we don't want to return anything, is just call response.end. And that'll just send back a typical 200 OK HTTP response. And that'll just basically allow the request to finish and keep the browser from hanging like it's currently doing. And that looks good. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our code and finish up our add new post function. Now, before we can put the finishing touches on our add new post function, we need to discuss events. Now, events are the secret magic behind Node. Node is fast because it eschews the multi-threaded model that most traditional web servers employ. Instead, Node does everything in a single thread. To make this possible, Node must go out of its way to make sure that the main thread is never blocked, and it does so through the use of an event-oriented paradigm. Everything in Node is based on events. In fact, you've already been using events without even realizing it. When we created our HTTP server in the very first episode, we signed up to be notified whenever a request event took place. To drive this point home, let's go ahead and take a look at another way we could have written our Hello World app to see events in action. So I want you to go ahead and create a new file, and we're going to basically create our new HTTP server inside of this file. And we're just going to go ahead and call it events.js and save it in the same folder as the one that contains your app.js file. And we'll start off the same way as before by requiring the HTTP package. And then we're going to go ahead and call the create server function from that package. But unlike last time, we're not going to pass in a callback function this time. We're just going to basically call the function without any parameters being passed in. And what that's going to do is create a new server object and return that. And we're just going to go ahead and capture that in a variable. So now at this point in time, if we were to call the listen function on our server object, our server would start running, but we wouldn't have any callback functions registered with the server to be called whenever a new request came in. So in order to remedy that, we're going to have to associate a callback function with the request event. And now in order to do that, there is a class called Event Emitter, which all classes in Node inherit from if they support events. And the Event Emitter class provides a function called on, which allows you to register a callback function with a specific event emitted by that object. And now a Node HTTP server object, such as the one we have here, inherits from Event Emitter. So it also provides the on function for us. And we're going to go ahead and call that now. And the first thing that you pass to it is the name of the actual event you want to hook your callback function up to. So in this case, it's going to be the request event. And now the request event expects its callback functions to take two objects, a request and a response object. And then the only thing that we want to do is just prove that this works. So we're just going to basically log that we got a request. And then finally, we need to call the end function on the response so that a proper response is returned to the browser and it doesn't hang on us. So what you see here is essentially the equivalent of what we did in the very first Hello World example, where we pass the same type of function into our create server function. The only difference here being that the create server function actually takes that callback function that we give it, which Node refers to as a listener function, and it hooks that up to the request event for us. So in this case, we're actually doing it ourselves rather than relying on the create server function. So now the only thing that we have to do to finish this off is just call the listen function on our server to actually get it up and running and listening for new connections and new requests. So go ahead and save that file, and let's jump over to our terminal and fire it up and just give it a try. So now if we just jump over to our browser and hit localhost at port 8000, we don't see anything here, but we also don't see it hanging. And now let's just jump back over to our terminal and just make sure that everything worked properly. And we see that we got a request, and if you notice, mine's actually showing it twice. And now the reason for this is that our browser is actually sending across two requests. The first is the request that you would expect, the request for the actual web page, and the second one is just a request for a favicon. So that's the reason why you're seeing two requests captured here. So we've just seen how to hook a callback function up to an event, but just how do we know what events each Node object actually emits? Well, the answer to that, of course, is the documentation. So let's go ahead and jump back into our browser and pull up the Node documentation and go ahead and take a look at the HTTP package, and then we'll take a look at the http.server object and just see what events are emitted. And you can see here a list of events, and we're just going to go ahead and choose one and go ahead and hook another callback function up to that just to see how you'll use the documentation to add new callback functions to events. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go with the connection event. So go ahead and click on that and let's take a look at the documentation for it. And now the documentation for the events will always give you at least a short description on when that event is emitted and also describe the inputs to the callback function. And above that, you can actually see the function signature for the callback function, and we can tell here that we're going to get one object, and it'll be basically a TCP socket object. So let's go ahead and jump back into our code, and right above the call to our listen function, we're going to make another call to on, and this time we're going to pass to that the string connection, which will basically tell it to hook our callback function up to the connection event. And then we'll go ahead and pass in the callback function, which again, like we saw in the docs, will take a single socket object. And then just like we did above, we're just going to basically log a string. In this case, we're going to say got a connection, just letting us know that a new connection was accepted and that our callback function was called whenever that happened. So let's go ahead and save this and jump back into our browser, hit refresh to see if this worked, and then we'll jump back over to our terminal again and take a look at the output, and we can see here up at the very top we have got a connection. So it looks like we were able to hook our callback function up successfully to a new event. Before we leave the topic of events and get back to finishing up our code, I want to quickly go over the event emitter class. And I want to do so with a little bit of an example to kind of show you how you can incorporate event emitters in your own code. So let's go ahead and fire up the Node REPL and just play around with the event emitter class a little bit. So to do that, you'll have to go ahead and require the events package. And then the very first thing that we're going to do is just create a brand new event emitter object. So go ahead and call the events.eventEmitter constructor. And now that we've got an event emitter object, we can actually create our very own events. So in this case, we're going to register a new callback function with an event that we just created, and we're going to call it timed event. And now our callback function that we're going to register with this event is going to take an interval, which is basically just going to be a simple integer. And the only thing that we're going to do inside of this callback function is basically just log that interval number. And now after playing around with events with our HTTP server, this should all look pretty familiar, nothing really out of the ordinary or surprising here. But now the next part is a little bit more interesting. We're actually going to emit our own events. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that on a timed basis. So we're going to use the setInterval function to actually fire off our event every so many seconds. In this case, we're going to do every 10 seconds. So let's go ahead and see how that looks. So we'll call setInterval, and we're going to pass it a closure. So we want to wrap our function here in a set of parentheses so that we can call this function immediately as soon as we're done creating it and therefore pass back an inner function, which is going to close over our internal variables. And then we'll create a variable called I, set that equal to 0. And then we'll return a new function which basically increments the I value and emits our timed event with that I value. So that I value is going to be that interval that's passed into our callback function. And then we're just going to close all this off and go ahead and call that function to create our closure. And then we'll pass in the number 10,000 to represent 10,000 milliseconds, or in other words, 10 seconds. So now whenever I hit return on this, it's going to basically start our timer and then emit our timed event after 10 seconds has lapsed. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let's hit return. And now if you notice, I've basically been returned back to the command line, and this is really the beauty of the event-oriented architecture. I'm not actually running our emitter in the background on a separate thread, but instead what's happening is I've basically just put it to sleep for 10 seconds. So I can do things, as you can see here, like perform IO, doing a console.log, and eventually you'll see that my interval times out and my event is emitted, and we see the interval printed to the screen. So now that we have a better understanding of how events work, we can finally finish up the code for our add new post function. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our text editor and finish up the code. But before we do that though, let's go ahead and start up our application using supervisor. So go ahead and close the events.js file and jump back over to your terminal. And I guess we can go ahead and remove the events.js file because we don't really need it. And then go ahead and start up our application using supervisor and then jump back over to the code again. And now the reason we've just gone through this little tangent talking about events is that we need to extract all of the information for our new blog post from the HTTP request that was just received. And the way that you go about doing that in Node is through events. Unlike other languages and frameworks where you might just do a call to a function or maybe to an attribute and get back all of the data that was associated with that request, in Node, since we can't block, we actually have to do this in callbacks. So to see which events we need to use to get that information, let's go ahead and jump back into our browser and open up the Node API documentation again. And then scroll down here to the HTTP package. And then we want to take a look at the HTTP request object. And down here we see a list of all the events, and the one that we want, or the two that we want actually, are data and end. So let's go ahead and click on data real quick. And now basically every time the data event is emitted, a new chunk of the message body has been received, and we basically want to grab that chunk and just append it to the rest of the body that we already have. And now the end event is emitted whenever the request is completely finished and there's no more data to be received from the request. So let's go ahead and jump back to our code and hook up a couple of callback functions to each of these events. And what we're going to do is create a new function here called parseBody. And it's another utility function, kind of like our render 404 function. So we're going to go ahead and just clean this section up a little bit and name it the utils section. And then right below that, we're going to go ahead and create our new function. And now our function is going to take two parameters. It'll take a request object and a callback function. And now what we're going to do is collect all of the data for the message body of the HTTP request. And once all of the data is collected, we'll call that callback function and pass the body to it. So the very first thing that we need to do here is then create a body variable that'll just basically hold all of the data that we're going to get. And then we need to attach our first callback function to the data event. And if you remember from the docs, that callback function is going to take a chunk. And then what we want to do is just append that chunk to our body variable. And then we want to hook up our next callback function to the end event. And the end event just signals to us that all the data for the request has been totally read in, so there's nothing that actually needs to be passed into the callback function, so of course it doesn't take anything. And then the only thing that we're going to do here is basically call our callback function and pass in the body that we've just collected. And now one thing to keep in mind here is that we can go ahead and pass the body string to the callback function as is, but it's going to be basically in the form of a query string. So we probably want to go ahead and parse that into something that's a little easier to work with, something like just a normal JavaScript object. And now Node actually provides a package that allows us to do that very easily. So let's just go ahead and jump up here to the very top, and we'll require another package. And the package name that we're going to require is query string. And then once we've required that, we can come back down here. And then before we pass the body string in, we just want to wrap it with a call to the parse function on the query string package. And then, like I said, that's just going to make sure that our callback function gets a nice JavaScript object rather than a string that it needs to go ahead and parse itself. And that's going to take care of our parse body function. If you're used to working in more traditional web development frameworks like Django or Ruby on Rails, then this probably seems slightly odd to you, because basically what you would normally be doing here is just creating a function that just parses through everything and returns the actual answer. So whenever you call it, you're essentially blocking on that function. But in Node, you have to get used to doing everything with events and callbacks, because the moment you block, you've completely and totally killed that server. And that's one of the dangers of using Node, but it's also one of the great things, because having that single threaded server is just super fast. It doesn't use anywhere near the amount of resources that a typical threaded server uses. And so at the end of the day, it's actually worth it to you to deal with a little pain as far as the coding goes to get that performance factor. So now that said, let's go ahead and finish up our add new post function. So let's go ahead and jump up here, and we'll delete our log statement since we don't need that right now. And what we're going to do is call our new parse body function here, and we'll pass in the request object and our callback function. And remember, our callback function is going to get the body object. And now we could just go ahead and use the body as is, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new post object and just grab the pieces that I want off of the body. In our case, this is kind of redundant, but once you start developing more complex applications, you're definitely going to have things like hidden fields in your forms, and obviously you don't want all those things polluting your nice post object. So in my opinion, it's good practice to get into to just go ahead and create a new object and just extract out the information that you want. And that's what we're going to go ahead and do here. So we'll create the object, and we'll set the title attribute equal to the body's title attribute, and the content attribute will do the same too as well. All right, and that pretty much takes care of our add new post function. We're actually properly processing our form post. And the next step, of course, would be to add this to a database, but we're going to save that for the next episode. In this episode, we just want to test this out real quick. So we're just going to drop down below this and just print out the information real quick. So we're going to print out the title, and we're going to print out the content. And this will just let us confirm that our form post processing code is working properly. So go ahead and save that, and jump back over to the browser. And we just want to go back to our new blog post form, and just go ahead and create a new form, and then click on the create post button, and then we'll jump back over to our terminal just to make sure that everything worked properly. And here we see the title and the content of our form post. So that pretty much takes care of everything. And that's pretty much going to wrap it up for us today. Today's lesson's been a pretty important one as far as Node goes. We learned all about events today, and that's really the secret sauce behind how Node works. If you don't understand events, then you're probably not going to be a very effective Node developer. So it's really important that you grasp this concept and that you play around with it a little bit on your own, just to make sure that you really and truly grok everything that there is to know about events. Another important part about today's lesson is, while we were developing our parse body function, we saw how Node's asynchronous nature can kind of make it slightly tougher for us to code at times. And maybe developing a Node isn't always the most intuitive thing, but you do get used to it after a while. And you have to remember that at the end of the day, it's well worth it to actually put up with just a little bit of pain dealing with the asynchronous nature of all the code to get the performance and the scalability that Node provides. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye for today, and I hope to see you in the next episode, where we'll be learning a little bit about Node's module system, and we'll be refactoring our code in a way that makes it easier to maintain and to develop. So I'll see you then.